Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and today we're going to be talking about the upcoming budget. Now, with Labour's first budget due at the end of October, we're going to be looking at specifically what we might be looking at, what we're hoping for, and what might be the results of what happens in the budget. And to help me through this is an expert in tax, Andy Wood, tax barrister and founder of Mosaic Chambers, Dubai. Welcome to you, Andy.
Hi, Stephen.
And Andy, I've got here a list of items that the press have been suggesting that we might be subjected to over the next few months. And I'm going to start off with inheritance tax, because from a property perspective, a lot of people have bought buy-to-let properties with a dual purpose, if not a triple purpose. That is, you buy the property, you rent it out, which lets you hold the property effectively. You're then hoping for a capital gain over a period of time. And it also may be a supplement to your pension. Although you can't have it directly as a pension, it can be a supplement to your pension.
Yeah.
So what would be the effect, if you like, of an increase in inheritance tax? And have you heard anything about this?
Well, I think first and foremost, your question regarding whether there will be an increase in IHT per se. At the moment, it's a fairly basic system, isn't it? Where you, broadly speaking, have a nil rate band, which is slightly more nuanced than that, and then anything above that which doesn't qualify for other inheritance tax reliefs is subject to tax at 40%. So there's a bit of a knife edge there. I don't see them really making any major sort of structural changes to IHT, and I don't see them bringing in any additional rates or any increased rates of inheritance tax. So bearing in mind that your average buy-to-let investor probably is unlikely to qualify for business property relief, for instance, for inheritance tax purposes, I don't see there being any significant changes in the budget for a property investor. I think any changes, I think most of these of the potential changes which may come through in the budget will be relatively simple, straightforward ones, rather than significant, complex structural changes. So I think inheritance tax changes around property, we may see something like the residence nil rate band removed. If you remember, I think it was George Osborne brought that in a few years ago for people who, generally speaking, in the southeast, who were property rich in terms of the main residence they lived in, they got a little bit of an extra nil rate band on death. Now that is an incredibly complex relief for something which seems relatively straightforward, and it's quite arbitrary in who it benefits. And I think something like that, particularly bearing in mind the ideological approach maybe to something like that, I think that is ripe for change, particularly.
Andy, we've been promised for years by various chancellors simplification of the tax system, haven't we? But I've yet to see much of it. I do quite welcome your thoughts on things being fairly calm in that area. I should just warn you that you should have your crystal ball there, because don't forget you'll be coming back after the budget to see if you were right or not.
Well, we'll see how it goes. We'll see how my predictions go first.
One in mind. Well, I suppose the next thing is how any of these tax increases might affect pensions. If I've got it right, your state pension is effectively a tax-free area at the moment, but of course if you're supplementing that, you are then going to fall into the tax trap, aren't you?
I think if you look at potential changes that we may see in the budget when it comes to pensions, it's perhaps more around the cost of tax relief when it comes to, I guess, people who are building their pensions. I think there's some figures that suggest that the income tax and national insurance tax reliefs cost the government, and we say cost because it's money that they
lack of income
collect, but is around 50 to 60 billion pounds a year. And what I'm talking about there is the income tax relief you get on contributing to a pension, whether you're putting money into a SIP or whether at the other end of the scale, I guess, whether you're making contributions through auto enrollment, and those obtain income tax relief by a couple of different mechanisms, but also, generally speaking, aren't subject to national insurance contributions either. So if you sacrifice some of your salary into a workplace pension, then you don't pay income tax, you don't pay NICs, and at the moment, employers don't pay any national insurance contributions. And you may ask why I said at the moment in due course, but all of that together is a staggering amount of value not collected by the government, as I say, 50, 60 billion pounds. I think that's an area where they can make some pretty quick and quite lucrative changes in the budget.
Now, the next thing, Andy, is I suppose stamp duty taxes or other taxes that they might either increase or put on second homes or investment homes, let's put it that way. I mean, I've often thought, I know we can buy and sell our own homes within reason, tax-free. I've often wondered whether that might be something that one government is brave enough to have a look at some point in time, because over the years you can make an incredible amount of money on moving home and selling your home, and it's tax-free. But I suppose the more immediate danger is if they start increasing stamp duty on second homes or buy-to-let. We're already sort of hearing talk about huge increases in council tax on second homes or buying in key areas that are subject to shortages because of second home purchases. What do you think about that?
I think it's potentially an area to watch, that particular space on the 30th of October, because again, I think I don't think it'd be controversial to say that Labour, ideology would be that they were, let's say, broadly against investment, so property in investment, and I can see potentially there being some changes there, and time again, the government has gone to stamp duty, hasn't it, as it's sort of favoured lever. And in the manifesto, Labour's manifesto, there was a promise that they were going to increase the surcharge on foreign property in investors. So at the moment, there's this 2% surcharge. If you're a non-resident person, individual or company, trust, whatever, and you have the temerity to want to buy a property, a residential property in the UK, then there's an additional surcharge of 2%. Labour have promised to put that up to 3%. So conceivably, you could be paying 18% stamp duty on a property just because you're non-resident. And that chimes into, I guess, the fact that if you need to fleece somebody, try and fleece somebody who perhaps doesn't have a vote in the election. So maybe that's maybe I'm being cynical. I
was going to say, you're being very cynical there.
And there's part of me that maybe thinks, well, if there is this black hole and we need to try and generate a few funds somewhere, could they go back and revisit the additional surcharge as well for second properties, which at the moment is 3%? Would it really be politically difficult for the Labour Party to say, well, let's make it 4%? and I have no sort of inside knowledge to suggest that is going to happen, but it would seem quite a popular area amongst the Labour Party to try and raise some taxes as well. I think just one other point, Stephen, is that I think it's also worth remembering that we've already got baked in as a change the change in policy from the previous Conservatives. If you remember, they were scrapping the FHL regime as well. So for those people who have historically had FHLs or since 2017 have seen that as and they introduced the restrictions in interest relief, some people moved into furnished holiday lets because that escaped those changes. So again, it's just worth reminding people that that regime will be curtailed from April 2025. And there's not a cat in hell's chance that Labour are going to U-turn on that one. I think it's probably safe to assume. There are other tax benefits have been in the FHL regime as well, and again, they're all going to be whipped out. So capital gains tax reliefs, they're beneficial for capital allowances, and also rather peculiarly, the income qualified for pension tax relief as well. Again, that will be ended from April.
Andy, I don't have a difficulty, let's say, looking at the buy-to-let market. If there's a slight increase on tax there, whether it be on the capital gain, which we'll come to in a minute, or whether it's on stamp duty on purchase. Because with a business, which buy-to-let is a business, you can calculate, you do your sums, and it either works or it doesn't work. And if you, at least if you know where you're going with it, you know what your fixed costs are, that's fine. But when you refer to overseas investment in the property market here, I've worked on developments here in Canary Wharf where the overseas purchaser has actually formed 70–75% of the purchasers of that building. These overseas purchasers kept our construction industry going, especially in London, over some of the difficult times that we've had. And so to sort of penalise them just doesn't seem to make sense to me. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I think under the current government, we could we're always in danger, I think, of seeing potentially ideological measures and ideological changes over perhaps things which make pure economic sense. But I think that the changes to SDLT really and using it as a real sort of way of raising revenue goes back well before Labour got into power. It goes back to really, I think, George Osborne, whether by luck or by good judgment, back in 2012, starting to introduce increased rates. And I think during that time, since that time, it's been a real revenue generator. I mean, there's only so much you can do with stamp duty, and particularly compared to things like income tax and NIC, which regardless of whatever way you look at it, and it's interesting that governments always seem to box themselves off in terms of income tax rates and NIC. They're the real heavy lifters, but clearly the government has seen as a way of maybe just squeezing a bit of extra cash, and I think the profile of your average property investor helps as well. They've got their metaphorical broadish shoulders, perhaps.
Andy, we've gone through this business of having Section 106 agreements here, where the local authority will hit the developer with quite a substantial and onerous obligation if he wants his planning, etc., etc. And the classic answer is, if the developer resists, well, you're property developers, you've got plenty of money, you know, you can afford it, this, that and the other, the prices of properties. Well, what they forget is they surely don't think the developer's paying it. All the developer does is take that 106 amount, divides it by the number of flats or homes that he's building, and charges the new residents that amount of money. And that's why we've got so many issues with our young people trying to get themselves onto the housing ladder. It's just becoming so costly and so prohibitive. So do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree, Stephen, with that at all. I mean, tax, in particularly in that context, will become a transaction cost, and you know, transaction costs tend to, they don't come out of thin air, do they? They're paid by somebody, and in most walks of life, they're paid by the the end user.
The end user, yeah. Okay, Andy, we're going to go to a break now. Thank you very much so far for all your information. After the break, we're going to be talking about capital gains tax and dividend taxes. So join me then after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. We're discussing the upcoming budget, and I'm joined by Andy Wood, who's a tax barrister. Andy, welcome back. Now, 2 things that are worrying property people at the moment. Capital gains tax changes. That could be quite horrendous, couldn't it?
I mean, there's been obviously a lot of talk about potential capital gains tax increases, and I think the danger can be looking at it quite simply. So you see the income tax rate up here, particularly when you had NICs on, and the capital gains tax rate down here, and you think that looks like a bit of a open net, really, for the government to take a bit of a kick at. But then I think if you look at some of the figures produced by the government, and you look at it and think actually some even rather quite modest rises to the capital gains tax rate become essentially revenue negative. So when you start looking at increasing that, and it's worth just pointing out to that currently the capital gains tax rate, the general rates are top rate is 20%. For residential property in the UK, it's 24%. But if you look at modest increases to that 20% capital gains tax rate, so 5%, that very, very quickly starts losing money for the government. And I think this is why you see when Jeremy Hunt decided to bring the 28% rate down to 24%, he chose that figure of 24%. Now, the government hasn't actually, when it produced its stats, didn't show the difference that 4% made, but 1% raised money, 5% lost it. So you can probably assume that there was some kind of sweet spot around 4%.
Does it lose money because of inactivity caused by the rise?
It's because of behavioural change, and again, the figure, you've got to be careful sometimes using government stats, and that sometimes they are static, which means they don't take into account behavioural changes, whereas these figures which have been published now, clearly nobody can 100% predict behaviour, but you can guarantee that if you have a capital gains tax rate of, let's say, 20% on an asset, and then suddenly it goes up to 45%. Now that is going to at least influence the decision on whether you sell now or wait 10 years and see what the next government has in mind. It might also think if you've got a £10 million gain and your capital gains tax bill has increased, you might think, you know what, actually I was going to hang around in the UK, but it's worth my time now to move overseas. So I'll wait until I'm non-resident and sell it, and then you know what, you won't get any of my tax money, Mr. Government. So it's those type of impacts that these figures have tried to incorporate. So I see a much more modest rise in capital gains tax rate. So maybe you see that 20% is all uprated to 24. But I don't really see a great deal more in terms of that headline rate. Now, I think something like business asset disposal relief, which already is a bit of a husk and a shadow of its former self, I could see that the rate of applicable to something that qualifies as BADR, which used to be people referred to as entrepreneurs relief, that moving from say 10% to 15%, because again, government figures suggest that if they add another 5% on top of the 10% rate, so it becomes 15, that raises about another £500 million a year. So that pound for pound is quite a nice move for them to make. So you may have a scenario, being very specific here, but you may have a scenario where the main rate is 24% and you've got a BADR rate of 15%, something like that. So it's not a terrible position from a capital gains tax point of view, and it's well, we're still far away from that equalisation of the rates, but it potentially would raise quite a bit of revenue for the government.
Andy, let's now move on to dividend tax. Now, I'm by no means a tax expert, but what this really means is that it's a way of extracting your money as a director or shareholder out of the company. Company pays a proportion, I pay a proportion, but it's a lot less than having to pay normal earnings tax on the money. I hope I put that correctly without getting told off too badly. But if that goes up, this really is going to affect all of these people that have been pushed into putting their buy-to-let properties into limited companies. And I'm presuming that's because the government find it easier to collect taxes from companies rather than individuals doing these things. But it's really going to have quite a detrimental effect on the value of that market, isn't it? If it goes up any, or if it gets sort of knocked out in any shape or form.
If they were to essentially align the rate of tax you paid on a dividend with that you paid, I guess, on other income, whether from your job or from your savings, I think that obviously would have an impact on the number of people who either set up through limited companies or carried on using existing ones. And I think primarily that would, because it would be pretty unfair, really. And I think again, when a lot of people look at this in quite, I think, a simplistic manner and only look at the rate of tax paid on the dividend versus what they would have got had they been a self-employed individual, or whether they had a 9-to-5 job. And what you've got to remember is that company has also paid corporation tax as well, and you can't ignore that. So if they were to bring in some kind of equalization of those rates, you would have to allow some kind of credit for the taxes paid by the company. And anybody who has been involved in tax in the past will know I am now talking about a regime, a horribly complex regime that used to apply, where you had something called advanced corporation tax, and you had to take into account this type of issue, and it would basically scrapped because at the end of the day it was too complex. What often does happen in tax is you go around, everything comes around again, and when the same old idea is dredged up, generally a draftsman dredges up the same legislation as well. But I think it would be pretty loopy to align dividend taxes with employment taxes, because again, you've got to do a lot of other spade work as well. I don't think the government, particularly this time, I don't think having to do a lot of spade work is particularly high on the agenda. They just want to, as I said at the outset, to some simple, lucrative things that they can do, generate some fees and revenue without too much change, without too much outcry, too much consultation, and raise some cash.
But that advanced corporation tax, that's when you had to pay the current tax that was due, plus was it 6 months in front for the next period, or however?
Yeah, again, it was just overly complex, and as I say, it was booted into touch many years ago, and it's almost a case of people kind of wanting to go back to the same situation and that back to the old situation, forgetting how much hassle it was.
But with the dividend tax, so you draw your money out on a dividend, or draw some money out on a dividend as opposed to wages. Wouldn't it be just simpler to say, right, well, whatever you take out is subject to whatever rate of tax, rather than have the company pay some and you pay some? That to me in itself is complicated.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could almost have I guess a scenario which they have in the US, where you, for all intents and purposes, for all legal purposes, you have a company, but you can, I think they call it check the box election. You tick a box on the tax return, and for tax purposes, you look through it. So almost as if you were a sole trader, or if there are multiple shareholders, like a partnership. So, I mean, something like that would be, as an administrative thing to do, would be quite interesting, wouldn't it? But it wouldn't raise any money for the government. So again, it's one of those things. Simplicity would be great, but I don't think it's on the agenda really.
Andy, we're coming towards the end of the show. Now I know that you're somebody who has taken your business and taken your expertise to Dubai, and you're now resident there. The final subject that I want to raise is this kite flying that the government have put out, a UK exit tax. How do you feel about that?
We've always been told there was a small boats problem, and I think this would be an answer to Labour's small jets problem. The problem is the jets are flying the other way, to the small boats coming in, and really an exit tax would be, I guess, something you could consider, because the issue is if we believe what everybody is telling us, and I think a lot of it is anecdotal, and it comes quite frankly from people like me, but I'm not sure there's any empirical evidence. I think there's one survey which is bandied around quite a bit, but it is by a global sort of citizenship company. I don't doubt their scruples or anything like that, but clearly it's in their interest to be promoting that particular line. But let's say it is true, and there is a mass net migration of the UK's millionaires. The question is, how do you stop people leaving, at least fiscally leaving? If they move themselves, you don't care, as long as they're still taxable if you're working in the Treasury, I guess. And there are a few ways you can do that. I mean, firstly, you can enforce the existing rules a bit better. So, metaphorically, you give the HMRC a navy and let them sort of patrol the borders and stop people leaving. You can tighten up the rules. So, I guess if you look very broadly at the test of residence, as you can spend a certain amount of time in the UK, you reduce that time. But I think the UK's rules are pretty overcooked when you look at global standards. Anyway, or you look at something two potentially very I guess quite egregious methods. One is the exit tax, which if somebody becomes non-resident, you say, well, thank you very much for your commitment to the country. We'll take a skim off of your assets or the appreciation in the value of assets while you've been in the UK, and that's usually referred to as an exit tax. The final option would be the nuclear option, which would be citizenship based taxation, which is something that two big guns do, the US and Eritrea, where rather than only whether they're just taxing people based on residence, they will tax you on your worldwide income, whether you are resident or not, but purely based on your citizenship in that country. Now, I think that would be again a step too far for the UK. So I don't see an exit tax or citizenship-based taxation coming anytime soon.
Or I suppose what we could do is go back to the 60s and introduce the Labour's exchange controls. that was sorted out in one, wouldn't it?
Don't joke about it.
Right. Okay, Andy Wood, thank you so much for coming in today and explaining the hopes and wish lists for the budget. As I said, do bear in mind you're going to be coming back and explaining the factual results in a month or so's time. So I look forward to seeing you then. Don't forget, Andy is a tax barrister and founder of Mosaic Chambers in Dubai. Again, thank you, Andy. Look forward to seeing you next time.
An absolute pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Join me again next time on Property Matters.